Dear colleagues, I would like to present you the research estimating the price for sustainable development of renewable energy sector on the example of Ukraine. The structure of the presentation includes introduction and literature review, methodology and data, results and discussion, and conclusions. The urgency of the research is due to the fact that renewable energy deployment contributes to the achievement of the global sustainable development goals. However, green energy still has higher generation costs compared to those generated from fossil fuels. Therefore, many countries apply state support mechanisms for the renewable energy generation and consumption. The conducted literature analysis has revealed the evolutionary stages of economic mechanisms for green energy development. To create the renewable energy supply in the market, the governments usually use feed-in tariffs. Many scientists indicate that quota obligations or renewable energy portfolio standards is an effective mechanism to provide both supply and demand for green energy. However, this scheme must be supported with net metering and financial instruments like credit lines, special compensation of green energy loans by local and state authorities, etc. As the green energy sector expands, it is advisable to use green oceans and tender systems to ensure the creation of a competitive environment in the field. Overall, the necessity of evolutionary changes in management mechanisms for green energy development is highly recognized by the researchers. However, few papers examine the feasibility of using specific state support schemes and the criteria for the transition from one to another to ensure sustainable renewable energy deployment. Thus, the purpose of this research is to estimate the price for sustainable development of green energy sector on the example of Ukraine based on evaluating the effectiveness of the feed-in tariff and justifying the feasibility of its further use in the country. Depending on energy import, Ukraine has been actively developing the renewable energy industry over the last decade. Today, the feed-in tariff is the main support scheme in the country. It ensured the intensive green energy deployment in 2009-2020. The reasons for this are the following. The feed-in tariff rates are the highest in Europe. They are fixed until 2030 and make renewable energy projects profitable. The state guarantees 100% of green electricity purchase. However, there are drawbacks, such as rising load on the state budget related to the payments for green electricity. Also, the renewable energy generation growth escalates the weighted average electricity price in the country, causing energy poverty in the Ukrainian population. During the lockdowns in 2020, the ecological issues emerged due to the increment of renewable energy share in the energy mix and balancing national energy system with maneuverable thermal power plants. One more disadvantage is disproportions in green energy technologies development in favor of solar capacities. Hence, the current situation requires reforming the economic mechanism used to support the renewable energy in Ukraine. The first alternative is to move to a green ocean system, which has not been launched yet due to many obstacles. Another alternative is revising the feed-in tariffs and cutting them to a greater extent than planned by law. To use it successfully, we need to answer the following research questions. The first, are the current feed-in tariff rates in Ukraine economically justified to ensure sustainable renewable energy development? The second, how do the changes in feed-in tariff rates and green energy generation volumes affect the financial loading of the state budget? And the third, is it advisable to involve new economic layers to regulate the green energy advancement? To find the answers, we have formed the research methodology. First, the feed-in tariff rates by the government must correspond to the average cost price of green electricity. Second, we use the levelized cost of electricity or core indicators to estimate the green energy cost price. Third, the feed-in tariffs should be higher than the average cost price of renewable electricity to make green energy facilities profitable. To answer the first research question, the factor of feed-in tariffs proportionality to the real cost price of green electricity, K sub REIT, is proposed. It can be calculated as a ratio of the feed-in tariff for the ICE green energy technology in the 10th year. This is indicator FIT sub REIT to the cost price of green electricity generated with this technology in the same year, or comma sub REIT. The proportionality factor reflects the state pricing policy efficiency in the green energy sector. It can be calculated for both the renewable energy technologies mix used in the country and a certain green energy technology. The convergence of the proportionality factor components and its values close to 1 indicate growing compliance of feed-in tariffs with the real green energy cost price and accordingly optimizing the feed-in tariff financial burden on the state budget. To answer the second research question, we use the indicator of the country's over budget, state budget over expenditures, OE sub SBREIT, associated with excessive payments at inflated feed-in tariffs for the ICE green energy technology in the 10th year. It can be calculated using the formula from the slide, where K sub AD REIT is a coefficient that considers additional economically justified factors influencing the increase in the unit price of electricity generated in the 10th year with the ICE green energy technology, and Q sub REIT, the amount of green electricity generated in the same year with the same technology. Over time, the growth of this indicator shows an increase in unreasonable state budget expenditures due to unbalanced feed-in tariffs. The initial data for assessing the economic feasibility of feed-in tariffs for large solar with a capacity of more than 10 megawatts and wind power plants with a capacity of more than 2,000 megawatts per turbine are given in the slide. The changes in feed-in tariff rates correspond to the Ukrainian energy legislation, and core data are taken from Lazarus reports. The figure on the next slide presents the results of calculating the proportionality factors of feed-in tariffs to the real cost price of green electricity generation for solar and wind technologies. The feed-in tariff for large solar power plants was almost equal to core in 2009. In that year, the feed-in tariff for large wind power plants exceeded core by 17%, which is acceptable in ensuring a normal return on the investment and considering the risk of doing business in Ukraine. Thus, the starting feed-in tariffs were economically justified. In 11 years, the gap between feed-in tariff and core for solar energy increased to more than 4 times, whereas for wind power plants up to almost 3 times in 2019. These gaps indicate the inefficient green energy pricing policy and highly inflated feed-in tariffs. The next slide shows the state budget over expenditures for solar and wind energy technologies in 2009-2019 due to inflated feed-in tariffs. There was an exponential increase in state budget overruns for green electricity generated by solar facilities in 2016-2019, while budget over expenditures for green electricity from wind are much smaller. The consequence is irrational spending of taxpayers' money recently counted of millions of euros. In 2019, for the first time, the cost prices of electricity from solar energy become lower than from wind energy for large solar and wind power plants. While maintaining the trends of cheapening technologies until 2030, the solar energy cost price will be 1 euro cent per kilowatt an hour, and those for the wind energy will be 2 euro cent per kilowatt an hour. Both green energy cost price indicators will be lower than those for energy generated from fossil fuels. Compared to the core forecast data, the divergence between feed-in tariffs set by the government and the real cost price of green energy generation will increase, as well as the state budget expended covered by Ukrainian taxpayers. Given the projected reduction in the green electricity costs, the latter may become a real competitor with traditional electricity. Thus, the feed-in tariff should be abolished for new similar projects in Ukraine. Overall, on the example of the large solar and wind power plant, the study showed that current feed-in tariffs in Ukraine are inflated and do not economically justified. Imbalance in green energy pricing policy causes the disproportionate development of large green energy capacities and devastates the state budget. Its losses are estimated at hundreds of millions of euros. Therefore, the government should revise the feed-in tariffs and bring them in line with global trends of the green electricity cost price. With the preservation of the feed-in tariffs, the amount of electricity generated by green energy facilities operating in the feed-in tariffs will increase. Consequently, state budget expenditures will rise even with fair feed-in tariffs. Therefore, it's necessary to gradually move away from using the feed-in tariff mechanism and apply other levers to regulate sustainable green energy development. Thank you for attention.